Tonight we're going to be talking about diasporism and anti-Zionism. They're both alternatives to Zionism, which we talked about last week, but they're different in terms of their focus, their positive message or lack thereof, and their relationship to the reality of the state of Israel and the Zionist movement itself. So I think you'll find this new information in some cases, or new perspectives on old information. And we will have a chance to talk a bit about anti-Zionism as it's expressed today in the latter part of the class. So as we discussed in more depth last time, and there'll be a link in the video notes at the bottom, Zionism itself is summed up very simply as the desire for and the work towards establishing a modern Jewish state in Israel. That's the essence of it, that there should be a Jewish state and it should be in the land of Israel. That's why it's called Zionism, after Mount Zion in Jerusalem. But within that umbrella of Zionism, just like what it means to be a patriotic American or what it means to be a loyal citizen of the French Republic, there is a range of ideologies that can be encompassed by that one term. It could be someone that accepts potential compromise on a two-state solution. They could call themselves a Zionist because they want self-determination for the Jewish people, and they accept self-determination for the Palestinian people, and they're willing to accept some Jewish state rather than risk there being none. That was the founders of Israel. They accepted a partition plan. Other Zionists, self-labeled Zionists, believe in a greater Israel that should include all of the West Bank, perhaps even Gaza, perhaps even the East Bank of the Jordan, which is now the Kingdom of Jordan. Hasn't been part of the Palestine Mandate since the 1920s, but they want to go back to that old map of the original Palestine under the Ottomans, to have as much state as much land and size of a state as possible for a future Jewish population. But those can be secular maximalists, right? You don't need to believe in religion for that. And there are other Zionists who would want a theocracy, who would want the rabbis and rabbinic law to run things in the state without a separate Supreme Court or other system of government that we would consider to be a hallmark of democracy. They can all claim that label of Zionist, and then the debate is, where you draw your boundaries. Does it have to be a democracy or not? Do you have to accept a greater Israel or not? Otherwise, you're not a real Zionist. In fact, in Israel today, the term leftist is almost like a slur. If you were alive in America during the 1980s and you heard people using the word liberal as a slur, it's the same kind of political demonization. So in any case, that's Zionism. The basic essence is there should be a Jewish state in the land of Israel. And a corollary to that for many Zionists was that that's where the best Jewish life could be lived. It was necessary for Jewish survival to have a modern state, whether as a refuge for Jews fleeing or as a cultural center for Jews, even those who lived outside of the state, to benefit from. You needed a center of gravity. Otherwise, you wouldn't survive. Between persecution and assimilation, integration to the surrounding world, you would simply vanish. That was the Zionist argument. Now, diasporism in some ways takes the opposite tack. It's not the same thing as anti-Zionism, as we'll see, but there are some similarities. Both diasporists and anti-Zionists, self-labeled, would be willing to criticize Israel, both militarily and conceptually. They would say, do we really need a Jewish state for Jews to survive? And is an ethnically defined state, an ethno-state, really a good idea? Is it really compatible with liberal or democratic values? Can you really have a democratic state that privileges one particular ethnic group or cultural group or religious approach over another? Or is a religion, ethnicity, race-neutral state the only one that can qualify as a true democracy? So they might share that critique of Israel. But as we'll see, diasporism really is not just an anti-ideology to Zionism, it's a competing ideology that also offers the possibility of a meaningful modern Jewish identity, but without putting Israel at the center. Diasporism would argue that maybe the Jewish people are the center, or maybe you don't need a center, and people simply are where they are and have roots where they already are. Instead of the Zionist project of planting your roots where you put your trees down in Israel, plant a tree next to you, and those are your roots. Now, when you look back at Jewish history, you might wonder, can you have a non-Zionist Judaism? Before modern times, all varieties of Judaism that we saw through Jewish history had some variety of connection to the land of Israel. They always pointed back to their origins in the land of Israel. They read biblical texts highlighting that. They often named their synagogues after places in Israel. There was a value of pilgrimage there at the end of life. At the end of their Passover Seders, they said next year in Jerusalem, and they hoped for it. They meant it. But it was kind of a light Zionism in most cases because they didn't actually move there themselves. They didn't take the message that I have to get there no matter what. Rather, they put it off until Messianic times. And, when you put it into Messianic times, it's, the unforeseen and unknowable future. There's a famous rabbinic story that if you're planting a tree and you hear the Messiah has come, finish planting the tree and then go check out the Messiah. So real life continues. The Messiah may or may not be true. We've been waiting a long time. So, it's the equivalent of mañana. Like someday in the future, maybe the Messiah will come. Okay. So that's the light Zionism of the past, where you were attached to Israel, you faced Israel when you prayed, but you didn't expect to go there anytime soon in great numbers. Now, with the start of the modern Zionist movement in the late 19th century, there were a variety of non-Zionist Judaisms in response to that, in the modern sense of Zionism, not in the traditional sense. So I'll give you three versions of this non-Zionist Judaism that were quite numerous in the late 19th, early 20th century. The first one is ultra-Orthodox Judaism. For the ultra-Orthodox, modern secular Zionism is chutzpah. What are you doing trying to do what the Messiah needs to do? That's wrong. It's heresy. Who are you to bring the Jews back to the land of Israel before God has ordained that it happen? It's dangerous. After all, the only true government of Israel in the Messianic era would be ruled by the Messiah. The word Messiah in Hebrew is Mashiach, which means anointed with oil. Who is anointed with oil? It's the king. So the Mashiach is the king. By the way, as an aside, the Greek term for Mashiach is Christos. So Jesus is not Jesus' last name Christ, or Jesus' middle name H, last name Christ. His title is the Anointed One. So he was thought to be the Messiah. That's why he got that title. And you might even hear this if you remember from Passover singing, the song Eliyahu Hanavi, Elijah the prophet. In the chorus, the middle part of it, the bridge, it says, Bimhera b'yamenu, soon in our days, Yavo Aleinu, come to us, Im Moshiach ben David, with the Messiah, son of David. So the line of David, the house of David, was the only rightful kings, and any kind of restoration of Jewish sovereignty would need to be under a Messiah, a king of David, not a democratically elected parliament with a prime minister and a ceremonial. That's narishkeit, foolishness, they would have said in Yiddish. And the only legitimate rule of law would be Jewish law. There's no secular law. You're not relying on precedents from the American Supreme Court or the British common law or anything. No, Jewish law, period. So there are, by the way, thousands, hundreds of thousands of ultra-Orthodox Jews living in Israel today. And you might say if they thought that Israel was heresy and chutzpah and dangerous and treif and not kosher, dangerous, violating Jewish norms. They see Jewish people driving cars all the time. Why are they there? Well, most of them got there after the Holocaust. They didn't go there on purpose earlier. Some of them grew up there. There is a native traditionalist Orthodox community there, and some did choose to go there in that kind of pilgrimage mentality. But most of them came in the remnants of the Holocaust, survivors from concentration camps, ghettos, or they fled the Soviet Union when they had the chance. They're refugees. And a large number of them today are also refugees from Arab countries. After Israel was founded, over the course of the next 20 years, from the late 40s to the late 60s, most Arab countries expelled most of their Jews. So you have thousands of Orthodox and what you would call ultra-Orthodox Jews from Morocco, Tunisia, Iraq, Iran, and so on. Today, those ultra-Orthodox Jews barely recognize the Israeli government. They use the money because they have to. They vote for their candidates for parliament because they want representation. They demand their subsidies for welfare payments and for child support payments, and especially for their yeshiva supports, because they don't even trust the state religious schools. They aren't religious enough. They have their own non-state schools that still demand money for educational support from the general government. And most importantly for them, they fight the mandatory draft. All Jewish men who are able-bodied are assumed to be subject to the draft, and most Jewish women too, for that matter, for varying periods of time. But beginning in the 1970s, what had been a smaller exemption of 1,000 students or so of the best and brightest became extended to all yeshiva students who were studying full-time. And so now, given the choice between staying in a yeshiva and studying full-time until you're 25 or 30 and past the draft age, versus getting drafted into this treifa army by this treifa government, by these heathen Jews who are telling you to do all these terrible things and showing you examples of women with bare sleeves and who knows what else, short sleeve with bare arms. Forget it. I'll stay in the yeshiva and stay away from that world I don't want to see. And they're sticking to that full exemption. Even now, in the midst of this war that's being fought in Gaza, they're extending the draft period for new inductees into the army. And they're extending the reserve period for reserve soldiers because they have such a need for person power. And even so, even at this moment, the ultra-Orthodox are saying, never, you're never going to take us. One of the chief rabbis of Israel, the Sephardic chief rabbi of Israel, was quoted just this past week saying, if they try to draft us, we'll all leave. We'll leave the state, which shows you how loyal they are to this state that has been supporting them so well for all these years. And they're going to find when they go out into America that they're not going to get the subsidies they've been getting in Israel to stay in yeshivas and study. That's not how it works here. You got to get a job. Like most ultra-Orthodox Jews in America have a job. They work. So it's they're going to find it's not as nice out there as it is where they are. Now, some ultra-Orthodox Jews are actually organized and promote themselves as anti-Zionists, like in-your-face anti-Zionists, not just ignoring the state, pretending it's not there, anti-Zionist. There's a sect called the Niturei Karta, which you'll see at Palestinian national events, and they are anti-Israel. They think Israel is evil, but they're a very small offshoot. But most of the Hasidic and ultra-Orthodox groups, including the Satmar Hasidim, which are some 25, 30,000 households, mostly in New York, and the Chabad Lubavitch movement, which is all over the place doing outreach and so on, they're not so pro-Zionist in terms of the secular state. So that's one strain of anti-Zionist Judaism, is ultra-Orthodox. They're clearly Jewish, but they're also not at all a fan of modern Zionism or the modern state of Israel. A second example of anti-Zionist Judaism were the integrationists in the 19th century, early 20th centuries. These are exemplified by early Reform Judaism, but it wasn't limited to self-labeled Reform Judaism. Their goal was integration into American and European society. And they were very strongly influenced by the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment claimed to be a universal approach, that it was open to anybody who had a rational mind, and all human beings, even Jews, had a rational mind. Therefore, they could contribute to society. They could become this new concept called citizens, where they weren't given status by their ethnic group or by their professional guild. They were simply a citizen in virtue of their reasoning mind and contribution to society as an equal citizen. So this attraction of the Enlightenment and the possibility of emancipation led to a Jewish response called Haskalah, enlightenment. If you know the Yiddish word sechel is like common sense or understanding. The Haskalah was to open people's eyes, was to make them inspired to learn modern languages and to be part of the society around them. This is the ideology that you could be a German of the Mosaic faith, that if my ethnicity was not a barrier to being part of the national identity, and I were like everybody else, I could have a different religion, but not have to identify differently in any other way. Just like you could have Protestant Germans and Catholic Germans, or Protestant Frenchmen and Catholic Frenchmen after the Revolution, of course, not before. It was harder when the Huguenots were expelled. But if you could be any religion but have a national political identity, then Jews could be Germans of the Mosaic faith, Frenchmen who happen to be Jewish by religion. They began to call their religious institutions temples. They called them temples because they said, we don't need to go back to Jerusalem. We don't need to rebuild the temple on Mount Zion. Here is our Jerusalem. Here is our temple in Hamburg, in Cincinnati, in New York, in Paris. That's why in many communities, the word temple, blah, 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 is a Reform congregation. And congregation, something, or something, synagogue is conservative because they weren't comfortable using the temple label. But temple was one of the signs of Reform Judaism because they said our temple is here. We're allowed to use the word temple where we are now. And often, once the new Zionist movement started, Reform congregations were opposed to Zionism. They were very concerned that any kind of movement to create a political Jewish state anywhere would lead to accusations of dual loyalty. How can you Jews be loyal to this country when you're trying to build a whole new state somewhere else? And what religion needs its own state? You know, ignoring Vatican City for the moment. What religion needs its own state? If you're American, then your religion is Judaism. And why are you working to create a political state anywhere else? It didn't jive with their redefinition of Jewishness as primarily, even exclusively, a religious identity. So I wanted to share with you a couple examples of writing by this approach. This is a poem entitled "Awake, My People," that is written by Judah Lieb Gordon. This is aimed at Eastern European Jews, originally published in 1866. But you can see some flavor of this integrationist ideology. Awake, my people, how long will you slumber? The night is past, the sun shines bright. You hear that image of enlightenment, right? The light shining. Awake, lift up your eyes, look around you, acknowledge your time and your place. So they want you to modernize, be like everybody else. The land in which we live and are born, is it thought to be part of Europe? Europe is the greatest of all in wisdom and reason. So notice not just when you are, but where you are. You're in the home of the Enlightenment. Jump on it. This land of Eden, Russia, opens its gates to you. Her sons now call you brother. This is a little exaggerated. I mean, he was idealistic, right? This is not how it turned out, certainly with the massive pogroms that began to take place in the 1880s. How long will you dwell among them as a guest? And why do you now affront them? See, the integrationist has a problem. If the Jews are a people, if the Jews are an ethnic group, they're not native. And therefore, they're a guest. And they live based on the hospitality of their host people. And if the host people get fed up with them, out they go. And why do they affront them? Why do you refuse to walk in the door they've opened for you? Already, it says in the next stanza, they've removed the weight of suffering from your shoulder. They've lifted off the yoke from your neck. They give you their hand. They greet you with peace. What's going to happen to that hand if you don't take it? It might turn to a fist. Raise your head high, straighten your back, and gaze with loving eyes upon them. Open your heart to wisdom and knowledge. Become an enlightened people and speak their language. Integrate. Become part of their culture. Don't be separate. Don't speak a different language. Don't plan to leave and move to another country. Don't work to build a nation somewhere else. Do it here. And do it like them. Every man of understanding should try to gain knowledge. Let others learn all manner of arts and crafts, those brave serving in the army, the farmers by plows and fields. To the treasury bring your strength, give your bounty, its share of your possessions. And then the key lines are the last two. Be a man abroad and a Jew in your tent, a brother to your countrymen and a servant to your king. So obey the laws of the country. Your brotherhood is your national citizenship. And what is your Judaism? Your Judaism is private. Be a person in the street and a Jew in your tent, privately. Synagogue, home. That's where your Judaism belongs. It's not a public thing, it's a private thing, and it's not a citizenship or a personhood. It is a religion. And in fact, some years later, and the American Reform Movement issued what they called the Pittsburgh Platform of Reform Judaism in 1885. And in this platform, this is after, by the way, the first stirrings of the Zionist movement have started, though it's before Herzl has his epiphany at the Dreyfus trial, and they start the World Zionist Congress in 1897. In 1885, the Reform Movement said very explicitly what they thought about Jewish identity. And you can hear the Enlightenment inflection here. We recognize in the modern era of universal culture of heart and intellect the approaching of the realization of Israel's great messianic hope for the establishment of the kingdom of David? No. The kingdom of truth, justice, and peace among all men. And here's the key line. We consider ourselves no longer a nation, but a religious community, and therefore expect neither a return to Palestine, nor a sacrificial worship under the sons of Aaron, nor the restoration of any of the laws concerning the Jewish state. So here the Reform Movement has taken an explicitly anti-Zionist perspective, and even an anti-traditional perspective, by the way. They don't want to restore the sacrifices under Aaron. They don't want to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. They don't want a messianic king under the line of David. Notice their messianic hope is the kingdom of truth, justice, and peace for everybody, not just the establishment of sovereignty for us. And they certainly do not expect a return to the land of Palestine. Now, Palestine here was the general term for the geography that doesn't have the political valence that it has today. But clearly, they are not interested in moving back. And they identify their Judaism as primarily a religious one and a non-Zionist one, for sure. Believe it or not, in 1942, there was actually an organization that was founded as a Jewish anti-Zionist organization under the umbrella of the Reform Movement. It was called the American Council for Judaism. And let me just, fix one thing on the sharing. The American Council for Judaism still exists, although in a much smaller form. And they still articulate that vision of Jewish identity that you saw in the Pittsburgh Platform. Founded in 1942, the ACJ has long offered a distinctive alternative vision of identity and commitment for the American Jewish community. We interpret Judaism as a universal religious faith rather than an ethnic or nationalist identity. So for them, Judaism is a religion, not an ethnic identity and not a national citizenship. We share with Jews everywhere special ties of history and destiny. These bonds are primarily spiritual and grounded in the distinctive teachings of the Jewish religion, capital R. We continue to embrace the prophetic ideals of classical American Reform Judaism, that was the Pittsburgh Platform of 1885, with its progressive values and worship traditions. And they also accept the evolution of those ideas. They especially affirm and celebrate the experience of Judaism in the United States. And notice what they say about Israel. We share with all Jews an appreciation of the significance of the land of Israel as the cradle of our faith. Along with all people of goodwill, we embrace the hope for a prosperous and secure state of Israel, living in peace and justice with its neighbors. As American citizens, our ties to Israel are historical and spiritual, but in no way political. We affirm that it is Judaism's religious and ethical ideas that are at the core of our Jewish identity and commitment. So here you have a very strong statement that their Jewishness is a religion, not an ethnicity, and that any connection they have to Israel is historical or because we have the same religion, and not because of any kind of ethnic or, heaven forbid, political allegiance that we might have to that state. So that's option number 2, is the integrationist or Reform Judaism style. That is not the case for Reform Judaism today. I'll just mention, and I saw Jessica's hand. I'll mention that the Reform movement today is much more pro-Zionist. In fact, they went back to Pittsburgh and issued a new Pittsburgh Platform in 1999 that very much is pro-Zionist, pro-Israel, encourages people to move to Israel, which is anathema to the people in 1885. But in 1999, they're willing to say that there's a positive benefit to supporting Israel. They also make the point that Israel can learn from what we're doing in diaspora too. It can go both ways. It doesn't have to only go one way. So they are sticking up for themselves while also affirming that being a Reform Jew in the 21st century can absolutely include a positive role for Israel. Jessica, go ahead.
The Pittsburgh 1885 statement, was that the official entree of Reform Judaism in America?
Yeah, it was issued by the Central Conference of American Rabbis, which was the rabbinical association. All the leading rabbis in the country were part of drafting that document. It really is a fascinating document to see what they were willing, how far they were willing to go in some cases. At one point, they say the Bible reflects the primitive ideas of its own age. Whew. Calling the Bible primitive, that's chutzpah. And also they said we reject all the rules about diet and dress. Those are entirely foreign to our current mental state. They are more apt to obstruct than to elevate Jewish spiritual experience. I mean, very anti-traditional in many ways. They also rejected heaven and hell as concepts foreign to Judaism. They did affirm a belief in an afterlife, but in their own sort of quirky way. They talk about the God idea as something they believe in, as opposed to like God, the personality. They're talking about a God idea, kind of a psychologized concept. So it really is a fascinating document to explore that. And, you know, for today's purpose, the focus is on the Zionist part of it, but the emphasis on a religion of reason as the essence of Judaism is really a fascinating experiment that is not really very widely accepted today. There are still some Reform congregations that follow what they describe there as classical Reform, but the vast majority of them are more like the 99 platform that's more Zionist and more traditional on the God stuff and the ritual practice stuff, as you'd see if you look up the 99 platform. But it's really an interesting exercise to explore both of those and see the comparisons. I have other classes I've done that do that in more depth. And if you're curious, just drop me an email to remind me, and I can send you a link for those. Okay, so now I mentioned, I highlighted there were three. Let me give you number three. We talked about the ultra-Orthodox. We talked about the early Reform Jews. There were also secular Jews who were non-Zionist or anti-Zionist. And their ideology has sometimes been described as diaspora nationalism in the ethnic sense of an ethnic nation, or you might even use the term that's common today, diasporism. Now, diasporists agreed with Zionists on a key point. Both Zionists and diaspora nationalists agreed that the Jews were primarily a people, that Jewish identity was primarily an ethnic and cultural identity, and the expression of that identity was the culture the people produced. So Judaism was made by the Jewish people, and Judaism lives in the Jewish people. It's not a supernatural entity that was dropped on them for them to follow. Now, historically, there was a major debate between the Zionists and the diaspora nationalists over language. What's the proper Jewish language we should focus on? Should we learn German and assimilate to the surrounding culture? That's what German Jews did, by the way, and those Reform Jews did. Should we speak Yiddish? That's the language we're already speaking, and it's a distinct Jewish language because the non-Jewish Poles and Ukrainians and Russians around us don't speak it. Or should we go back to the original Jewish language of Hebrew and use that as our primary language of Jewish cultural expression? Now, the language debate was really emblematic of a larger question. Both diaspora nationalists and Zionists agreed there's a problem. Jews are oppressed in Europe in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. The debate is, where should we fix this problem? And how can we fix this problem? In fact, maybe the bigger question is, how could we fix this problem? Do you fix the problem by simply moving the Jews out? If the problem is unfixable, then we have to leave. Or if the problem is fixable here, what has to happen to make Jewish life tenable in this diaspora experience? Now, the diasporists, of course, said, let's stay here and fix it. The Zionists said, it's unfixable, we have to leave. That was a basic, division between the two groups. Now, the diasporists or diaspora nationalists were often socialists. I mean, keep in mind, most of the Zionists were labor Zionists. They were socialists too. So they agreed on the economic questions too. They agreed on the who are Jews, and they agreed on the economics, but they disagreed on where to do it. They both wanted to be socialists, but some wanted to do it in Europe and some wanted to do it in Israel. They were, as socialists, anti-religion. Right? They'd been secularized, call it by the Enlightenment. They might have read Marx, religion is the opiate of the masses. Now, where the socialists and the diasporists differed from the Zionists was that the diasporists tended to be a little more universal in their orientation. Remember, the Zionists want to save the Jews. It's about what's good for the Jews. And what happens to the world outside of us, in some extent, is not our concern, or it's nothing we can control in it, at any rate. But for the diaspora nationalists who were socialists, they're part of this universal socialist movement. Remember, it's not workers of the Jews unite. The slogan at the end of the Communist Manifesto is workers of the world unite. You have nothing to lose but you're chained. It's everybody. What was the anthem of the world communist movement? It was the Internationale, right? It was not national-based or ethnic-based or religion-based. So the key concept of diaspora nationalism was a Yiddish phrase, Doigkeit. It's two pieces to that word in Yiddish. Doi or do means here, and kite is like ness. So Yiddishkeit is Jewishness. Menschlichkeit is the quality of being a good person, a mensch. So Doigkeit is the quality of being here, of doing it here, of fixing it here, of putting our roots down here, where we are. It's your orientation as here-ness. Let's develop a secular Jewish culture in the language we already speak, instead of trying to teach everybody this new language that only the elites know and doesn't even have the word for electricity. Let's do it here with what we have, the language the people already speak. And if you're a socialist, why are you trying to teach people the religious elite language? Why not start with the language they already have? Make them more literate in that. That's a dignified language, right? The dignity of the workers, the peasantry. That's our dignity, is Yiddish. If we're going to want to improve the situation Jews are living in, we need to fight for Jewish rights here, where the Jews are, and not imagine we're going to move millions of them to this backwater corner of the Ottoman Empire, let alone get permission to build our own state there. Now, when they talked about Jewish rights from this diaspora nationalist perspective, it wasn't just individual rights to be citizens or to be safe in your person. It was also national or ethnic rights, rights to print your own newspapers in your own language without government censorship, rights to run theaters and cultural institutions, rights to run schools that taught your language and your particular culture with government support in a multicultural empire. Remember, in the late 19th century, you've got the Russian Empire with all these different ethnicities, Poles, Ukrainians, Latvians, Lithuanians, and Jews. You've got the Austro-Hungarian Empire with Serbs and Croats and Bosnians and Jews. So in the context of these multi-ethnic empires, their vision was every ethnic group, every nationality in the terms of those days, would have national rights to live their cultural life, to teach their students, to interact with the government, to elect political parties that represented their interests. This actually took place in Poland in between World War I and World War II. In the interwar period in Poland, there were very successful Jewish political parties that elected members to the Polish Sejm. Remember, Jews were 10% of the population at the time. And so they were members of the Jewish Workers' Bund that were elected to the Polish Sejm because they represented the voice of the Jews and advocated for Jewish rights and funding for Jewish schools. And they ran their own Yiddish language school system called the Seicho system. And in the big picture, you wanted to change society. If Jews were not included and there were legal discrimination they faced, then even if it took a revolution, we will make Jews successful, rooted, and prosperous here rather than imagining they could do it somewhere else. And by the way, that revolution that would help the Jews would help everyone too. It wasn't just what's good for us, it's what's good for everybody. That's the vision of an idealistic socialism. So Yiddish labor organizers and these diaspora nationalists, who often were the same people, would talk about a schöner und a bessere Welt, a more beautiful and a better world, not just for us, but for everybody. In fact, their term for secular was weltlich. Weltlich means worldly, but this worldly, but also universal, right? They're oriented towards all peoples. And they were especially attracted to socialism because socialism was officially anti-Semitism. It was opposed to doing that. And so it was opposed to any of those anti-Semitic laws, rules. Again, the workers of the world included Jews. So in theory, they would be welcome and supported. A famous diaspora nationalist, cultural diaspora nationalist, was a historian named Shimon Dubnov, who was instrumental in organizing the first modern Yiddish research institution called YIVO. There's still a branch in New York. There used to be a large one in Vilna before the war, of course. And the most famous entity that was part of this diaspora nationalist milieu was the Jewish Labor Bund, which was founded in 1897. You notice, same year as the World Zionist Congress, the Jewish Labor Bund was founded too. And you can imagine the question, which is more realistic? The Bund's program of 1897 of creating a socialist integration of Jews in Eastern Europe where they spoke the language and where they had roots, or the Zionist project of moving all those Jews to the land of Israel and somehow getting a state? You know, which is realistic and which is utopianism? In fact, I'll share with you an example of that approach. Here's the Bund from their fourth party convention and their rejection of Zionism. The convention regards Zionism as a reaction of the bourgeois classes to the phenomenon of anti-Semitism and the abnormal civil status of the Jewish people in Russia. The convention regards the ultimate goal of political Zionism, the acquisition of a territory for the Jews, as an objective of little value, because such a territory would be able to contain but a fraction of the whole nation, and thus would be incapable of solving the Jewish question. Hence, to the extent the Zionists seek to concentrate the whole of the Jewish people, or at least a majority of the Jewish people in a single land, they pursue a utopian goal. Furthermore, the convention believes that Zionist propaganda inflames nationalist feelings and hinders the development of class consciousness among the Jewish proletariat. Remember, the goal of socialism was raising your class consciousness, not your ethnic national divisions. And so if we use Yiddish, it's to encourage these people to, open their eyes to the realities of Marxist analysis, not necessarily to preserve their identity. But this shifted over time. After the experience of persistent persecution, even within the socialist world, the Bund became more pro-Jewish identity and not just universalist. This was always a balance for them because they had this universal idea of workers of the world, but they had the particular experiences of Jews and the particular attachment of Jews to Yiddish and Jewish holidays and language and so on. The Bund at one point was expelled from the Comintern because they were too nationalist, too particularist. They were sometimes called Zionists with seasickness. That is, they wanted a national identity, but they refused to get on a boat. So they were just going to do it here because they were afraid of the boat. Or you think of the example of Leon Trotsky. You know, Leon Trotsky was born Jewish, raised Jewish, took on his revolutionary name, and totally rejected any kind of positive Jewish identity. Rosa Luxemburg, another famous socialist revolutionary, famously wrote in a letter to one of her friends, "I have no room in my heart for Jewish suffering, any more than any other people who suffer anywhere in the world. I'm just a universalist," right? And so she didn't want any particularism in her socialism. The Zionists and the socialists and the diaspora nationalists were all battling for Jewish hearts and minds and allegiance. Sometimes it was battling for youth group participation because they wanted to get the youth involved. And they all had very active youth movements. Sometimes it was a question of which youth movement was reputed to have the prettiest girls involved in the group that got you to go to one or the other. It wasn't all, rational thinking the whole time. But it was a war of words when it was theoretical. Is the world communist revolution going to solve it? Is a socialist multicultural democracy going to solve it? Is moving to Israel going to solve it? Well, that was the argument. You had the Russian Revolution, 1917 and 18, which created a window for pro-Soviet Yiddish culture that ultimately slammed shut and led to greater persecution. You had the Boycott movement of wanting to stay in Poland and Ukraine and Russia and fix things there that was crushed by the Soviets because the Bund was expelled from the Soviet Union in the 1920s and ultimately was destroyed by the Nazis during the Holocaust. And the vast majority of Bundists that did not leave already as immigrants were killed during that war. And then you also have, of course, the Zionist movement, which does succeed in creating a state after 1948. So the Zionists win in history, but whether they win the argument is a different question. After 1948, the Bundists that were still there might have criticized Israel's behavior, but they weren't really anti-Zionist. They didn't want there to not be a Jewish state. They accepted there was a Jewish state. Some of them even lived in that state after the war. And perhaps some of the reason why they didn't want there not to be a Jewish state, given the reality, aside from the need for a refuge, was that they had a positive mission of their own. They weren't defining themselves only by, you're doing it wrong. They had their own way of doing Jewishness based in Yiddish and Jewish history and Jewish culture that was a positive way to celebrate who they were. So now turning to talk about the anti-Zionists. There were some Jewish anti-Zionists all the way through this period into today, of course. But most of them, before the 1970s, we'll say, were primarily Jewish communists, Jewish far leftists. They were following the Soviet Union's line. And by the 1950s, there weren't that many of them left. There were lots of Jewish communists in the 19-teens. They were the vast majority of the American Communist Party, for example. But with what the Soviet Union did to Yiddish culture and Jews in the 1920s and 30s, and then the Soviet Nazi non-aggression pact of 1939, the Soviets making a deal with the Nazis, how could you support that? The Soviet Union supported the riots against the Zionist movement in the 1930s that killed lots of Jewish civilians. And so Jews who were in the Communist Party began to say, what am I supporting here? I'm supporting people that are killing my people, and that's not going to work. After the war, there was a crackdown on Soviet poets, many of whom were killed in 1947. You had the further crackdown on Jewish cultural life in the 1950s. You have, after Stalin dies, Nikolai Khrushchev gives a secret speech that then gets published that details all of the crimes of Stalin, and a lot of Jews leave then. And even after 1967, after the Six-Day War, the Soviet Union turns rabidly anti-Zionist and also begins to oppress Jews who might want to leave or express some Jewishness. This is the beginning of the Refusnik period. So Jewish leftists can't really be as pro-Soviet because they see what the Soviet Union is doing, and it also undermines their anti-Zionism. They're still willing to criticize things that Israel does that they feel are wrong, anti-democratic, discriminatory, but they're not anti the state of Israel anymore by that time. Now, you certainly had in the communist world support for the Arab world. It's anti-Zionism, of course, is political and military, not just ideological or standing on a street corner. And this accelerated after 1967 with the Six-Day War with Israel and its conquest of the West Bank and Gaza. If you're part of the Jewish establishment today, when you hear the word anti-Zionism, it sets off your anti-Semitism radar because you assume that Zionism is a part of most Jews' identity. And most Jews do identify with the state of Israel to some degree. And so if you're anti-Zionism, you are saying you can't be Jewish and here because your Jewishness is connected to your Israelness or your support for Zionism. And after all, they would say it's anti-Semitic to say you can be in favor of a Palestinian state but opposed to a Jewish state. If you're opposed to an ethnic state as a general principle, fine. Then you can also talk to France and Germany and China about their laws of return and their privileging of their culture. But in any case, if you're opposed to an ethno-state, fine. Then you wouldn't be in favor of a Palestinian state either. But if you're in favor of a Palestinian state and opposed to a Jewish state, then that begins to feel like a double standard. So here's an example of an ad that was run in the New Republic in 2002. You can see the headline here. Anti-Semitism. It's not a history lesson, it's a current event. Part 2. Once again, anti-Zionism becomes anti-Semitism. Anti-Zionism is showing its true colors as deep-rooted anti-Semitism. No longer are the Arab nations camouflaging their hatred of Jews in the guise of attacking Israel. And here are some examples of the unprecedented anti-Semitic wave throughout the Middle East, including conspiracy theories about 9/11, Holocaust denial, comparing Israel to the Nazis and Hitler, and anti-Semitic stereotype of the protocols of the Elders of Zion and the blood libel, and so on. And give us money at the ADL to help fight this issue. That's standard. Or another example is a statement issued by the U.S. State Department in 2010 defining anti-Semitism. And you'll notice that they have a whole section of this statement focused on Israel specifically. And here are examples in which anti-Semitism manifests itself with regard to the state of Israel. If you demonize Israel using classic anti-Semitic images or symbols, bloodthirsty, big noses, those kind of things, comparing contemporary Israeli policy to that of the Nazis, blaming Israel for all interreligious or political tensions. It's all their fault. It's only their fault. A double standard, as we said before. Or multilateral organizations focusing on Israel only for peace or human rights investigation. If they're only talking about Israel, they're not talking about China or Syria or North Korea, then it's a bias there. And finally, denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination and denying Israel the right to exist, the State Department statement says, is an expression of anti-Semitism. Again, if other peoples around the world are able to have a state and the Jews are not, why the Jews? Well, the only explanation they would offer is anti-Semitism. So this gives you some context for the reaction of many American Jews to the experience of hearing anti-Zionist statements or critiques of the state of Israel. And this culminated in 1975, again after the Six-Day War, with a resolution issued by the United Nations General Assembly. Now remember, 1975 is after the Six-Day War. Israel's conquered the West Bank and Gaza. It's also at the peak of the anti-colonial movement, because European powers have been leaving over the last 20, 30 years their overseas colonies, their African colonies. And so all of these nations become independent states, and they are part of the anti-colonial bloc. And they've decided by the 1970s that Israel represents European colonialism. You hear echoes of that today. And therefore, its ideology must be suspect. So you hear them drawing on other statements that the UN has previously issued, claiming that any doctrine of, this is the quote here in the first paragraph, any doctrine of racial differentiation or superiority is scientifically false, morally condemnable, socially unjust and dangerous, and they are expressing alarm at the manifestations of racial discrimination evident in some parts of the world. They recall that the GA talked about the unholy alliance between South African racism and Zionism. Notice they don't even capitalize the word Zionism. The Declaration of Mexico on the Equality of Women included rejection of colonialism and neocolonialism, foreign occupation, Zionism, apartheid, and racial discrimination in all of its forms, as well as recognition of the dignity of peoples and their right to self-determination. So the native people, the indigenous people, they have self-determination, but the colonists don't. And Israel's government is lumped in with the colonial approach. The Organization of African Unity in 1975 refers to the racist regime in occupied Palestine, comparing it to Zimbabwe and South Africa. They have a common imperialist origin, forming a whole and having the same racist structure organically linked in their policy of repressing the dignity and integrity of the human being. And therefore, they vote to decree Zionism as a form of racism and racial discrimination. This wasn't repealed until 1991 in the context of the Madrid Peace Conference and the opening of the Oslo peace process. So that's the backgrounds to anti-Zionism, both within the Jewish world, but also more broadly in the left side of the political spectrum. I mean, there were, for sure, right-wing anti-Semites too, who are not fans of Zionism. And, you can easily be an anti-Semite and an anti-Zionist, an anti-Israel statement. But there are plenty of people who would argue that they are not anti-Semitic, but they are opposed to the state of Israel or to Zionism more broadly as an ideology. And so what I'm going to do now is share a couple of statements by these groups. You can see some examples of the language that they choose to use. So the first one is an organization called Jewish Voice for Peace. You sometimes hear it incorrectly called Jewish Voices for Peace. That's not the name of it. And this was their mission statement. It used to be on their website. It's not on their website anymore, I don't think, or at least not at the same URL. They may have updated it, but this represents sort of their founding ideology. And so you'll see how they present themselves. Jewish Voice for Peace members are inspired by Jewish tradition to work together for peace, social justice, equality, human rights, respect for international law, and a U.S. foreign policy based on these ideals. So they're claiming a Jewish mantle. How can I be anti-Semitic? I'm doing what I do because of Jewish tradition. JVP opposes anti-Jewish and anti-Muslim and anti-Arab bigotry and oppression. They seek an end to the Israeli occupation of the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem, security and self-determination for Israelis and Palestinians, a just solution for Palestinian refugees based on principles established in international law, an end to violence against civilians, and peace and justice for all peoples of the Middle East.
So JVP seeks to end an end to the Israeli occupation of the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem. Is that like everything, right? Or is there like a tiny part in the middle that
no.
I'm not quite sure what this is saying.
What that would leave is the Israel that existed from 1949 to 1966. It would just be pre-Six-Day War Israel.
Right. Okay.
So it's and that was Israel, and it was a state, and so it existed at the time. It was more precarious. It didn't have as much space. Obviously, it would mean removing all the settlements in the West Bank, and in East Jerusalem after what had been the no man's land, and pulling out of the old city. I mean, this is where it's sort of a non-starter. Israel is never going to leave the old city.
Right. No.
And the old city was in East Jerusalem, but if you fully withdrew from East Jerusalem, you'd have to pull everybody out of the old city and lose the Western Wall and the historic cemetery, the Mount of Olives. It's never going to happen. But in any case, so then they have a couple points here on one state or two. We support any solution that is consistent with the full rights of both Palestinians and Israeli Jews, whether one binational state, two states, or some other solution. It's up to them to have a mutually agreed upon solution. However, we also believe it's our obligation to offer honest analysis about the diminishing likelihood of a two-state solution given decades of Israeli settlement and expansion and the current Israeli leadership's open resolve to block the creation of a Palestinian state. Again, notice who's being blamed for the issue. JVP endorses the civil society call for boycotts, divestment, and sanctions until Israel abides by international law. We reject the assertion that BDS is inherently anti-Semitic and defend activists who employ the full range of BDS tactics when they're demonized or wrongly accused of anti-Semitism. We believe it's a meaningful alternative to passivity engendered by 2 decades of failed peace talks is the most effective grassroots means for applying nonviolent pressure to change Israeli policies. So from that perspective, the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement is not anti-Semitic and is nonviolent. If you want, nonviolent Palestinian resistance as opposed to violent Palestinian resistance, aka terrorism, well, here's an alternative. But of course, this is also seen as a direct attack on Israel's viability. And in fact, I have here the statement for calling for BDS that was issued in 2005. So you'll see some of the underlying passages. 38 years into Israel's occupation of the Palestinian West Bank, Gaza Strip, and Syrian Golan Heights, Israel continues to expand Jewish colonies. Notice that term colonies there, and the colonial wall. That's, again, putting Israel on the side of the colonists. So this is 38 years after 1967. That's the Six-Day War. It has unilaterally annexed occupied East Jerusalem and the Golan Heights. It's annexing parts of the West Bank by means of the wall. It's preparing to build and expand colonies in the West Bank. 57 years after the state of Israel was built mainly on land ethnically cleansed of its Palestinian owners, a majority of Palestinians are refugees, most of whom are stateless. Moreover, Israel's entrenched system of racial discrimination against its own Arab Palestinian citizens remains intact. So here it's going back to 1948. That's the founding of the State of Israel. And it's claiming that even that land is illegitimate because it was ethnically cleansed, and Palestinian refugees are still longing to return. So given that since 1948, hundreds of UN resolutions have condemned Israel's colonial, again, and discriminatory policies, given that all forms of international intervention and peacemaking have failed to convince Israel to follow humanitarian law, in view of the fact that people of conscience have historically shouldered the moral responsibility to fight injustice like apartheid in South Africa through forms of boycott, divestment, and sanctions, in fact, inspired by the struggle of South Africans against apartheid, we representatives of Palestinian civil society call on all people to impose broad boycotts and divestment initiatives against Israel, similar to those applied in the apartheid era. They even invite conscientious Israelis to support this call. These nonviolent punitive measures should be maintained until Israel meets its obligations to, number one, end the occupation and colonization of all Arab lands and dismantling the wall. So here, Jessica's question is relevant. What's all Arab lands? Does that mean even the state that was established at the armistice lines in 1949? Recognize the fundamental rights of the Arab Palestinian citizens of Israel to full equality, and respect, protect, and promote the rights of Palestinian refugees to return to their homes and properties as stipulated in UN Resolution 194, which is the 1948 resolution. So let all refugees go back to their pre-refugee homes in what is known as Israel proper, or the inside the green line, the Israel of 1948 to 1966. So the BDS statement takes a relatively rational rhetoric to it, but their conclusion they're proposing would eliminate an Israel. Because when you end the occupation and colonization of all Arab lands, and Israel is inherently colonial, then there is no Israel. So that's their end goal in the original statement. Now, these are reasonable statements to some extent. The JVP, the Jewish Voice for Peace version, and the BDS version. We'll take a look at an irrational one in just a moment. Yes, Brum.
I was just clarifying that the BDS version isn't from the pens of Jewish Voice for Peace.
No. The Palestinian Civil Society issued the BDS call, and JVP proudly endorses the call for BDS. So,
Palestinian Civil Society is the name of a group?
Well, no, it's a bunch of like mayors and like leaders and of NGOs and so on. There's a whole list of signatories to it. It's not a particular group.
Thank you.
Yep. So now let's take a look at something that is not rational. This is from the Hamas Charter in 1988. There's been a revised version that's a little bit more rational, but still includes some of the nasty stuff. For a long time, the enemies have been planning the achievement of what they have attained. They strive to amass great and substantive material wealth, which they devoted to the realization of their dream. With their money, they took control of the world media, news agencies, the press, publishing houses, broadcasting stations. They were behind the French Revolution, the Communist Revolution, and most of the revolutions. With their money, they formed secret societies like Freemasons, Rotary Clubs, the Lions, for the purpose of sabotaging societies and achieving Zionist interests. They were behind World War I when they were able to destroy the Islamic Caliphate, making financial gains and controlling resources. They obtained the Balfour Declaration, formed the League of Nations through which they could rule the world. They were behind World War II, through which they made huge financial gains by trading in armaments and paving the way for the establishment of their state. World Zionism, together with imperialistic powers, try through a studied plan and an intelligent strategy to remove one Arab state after another from the circle of struggle against Zionism in order to have it finally face the Palestinian people only. Today it is Palestine. Tomorrow it will be one country or another. The Zionist plan is limitless. After Palestine, the Zionists aspire to expand from the Nile to the Euphrates. When they will have digested the region they overtook, they will aspire to further expansion and so on. Their plan is embodied in the protocols of the elders of Zion, and their present conduct is the best proof of what we are saying. That's anti-Zionism. a form of anti-Zionism that is clearly anti-Semitism, right? You see all the accusations there. Now, today, there are a number of strains that come together in the broader anti-Zionist zeitgeist. You have the anti-colonial movement, which we talked about, and we also talked a bit about last time. You have the Palestinians themselves and those of the Arab peoples and Muslims around the world who have solidarity with their co-religionists and their co-ethnic people. It's very understandable that they're opposed to Zionism because it reflects, a rival nationalism for their own people and one that they see as oppressing their own people. And, I would be willing to stipulate is oppressing both Palestinian Arabs in Israel proper, who are citizens, who have a discriminatory experience, and those in the West Bank and Gaza that are anywhere from, oppressed, imprisoned to under assault. There's also the ideology that Israel is a reflection of white supremacy. Notice in that Zionism is racism statement, the connection of Israel to European colonialism. And so the assumption that all Jews are European and white, and therefore Israel is a European colony. Again, we talked about last time with the fact that a majority of Israelis now come from the Middle East and North Africa, or Africa proper, like Ethiopian Jews, and not from Europe or from America for that matter. But this is what happens when people map American issues onto the world. They assume it's the light people versus the dark people, and the dark people are the indigenous people, and therefore the light people are the evil people. It's just not that clean of a map in Israel. And finally, there is a group that are anti-Zionists who are anti-militarism. They are pacifists and are opposed to all military interventions. And by the way, some of them have been opposed to supporting Ukraine because they see that they feel like Ukraine is causing the problem by fighting back. And so, they should make peace with Russia to stop the killing. Their goal is stop the killing, stop the killing, stop the killing, no matter what. And the dilemma is, of course, when you're facing someone who is doing the killing, sometimes the only way to stop the killing is to kill the killers. And that was the initial response of Israel to October 7th, and the attack of Hamas was justified. I mean, you can't just let people go in and maraud in your own country. But when does the collateral damage become so much that killing the killers is causing too many collateral deaths? I think that's the point we're at now. Others may disagree. In any case, some of those who are what we would call the diasporists are today actively anti-Zionist. But others have a positive program that is not directly related to Israel and its sins. Now, some of the anti-Zionists spend all their time talking about Israel. And there's a quirky kind of identity that makes you only talk about the people you don't like. Positive diasporists would not only focus on the current sins of Israel, of violence, no matter the context or explanation, or they would focus on the claimed original sin of Israel and its colonial occupation and dispossession. The positive diasporists are focusing on reclaiming Yiddish language and Yiddish culture, rediscovering the history of the Bund and its socialist activism, celebrating the experience of Jewish dispersion and global history and diverse cultures. They're defining their Jewish identity by the places and experiences the Jews have lived in and are living in today, instead of only focusing on their origins or their political sovereignty. And they're very much engaged in intersectional activism for the good of all. Remember that Schöner and Besser Welt, the better and more beautiful world the Bund fought for? It wasn't just for Jews, it was for all people. And so a diasporist would definitely see what's good for the Jews in diaspora is good for all peoples in terms of tolerance, acceptance, and diversity. Now, it's absolutely possible to be both anti-Zionist and anti-Semitism. But it's also very possible to be anti-Zionist because you're already anti-Semitic, right? That's the expression of Judaism. It's got a big Jewish star on it, and I don't like that state, so I don't like Jews, or I don't like Jews, so I don't like that state. That's totally possible. I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm just saying it's also possible to have objections or concerns about Israel conceptually or practically or ideologically, or to have a non-Israel focused identity like this diasporist ideology. There's a moving expression of this concept of Doigkeit that I wanted to share to conclude, but let me take a look at this question in the chat. Do we count anti-ethnic nationalism, pro-civic nationalism as anti-Zionists? Well, I think they would be anti-Zionist as they would be anti-patriotism and anti-national boundaries. You know, they'd be pro-open borders. They would not be in favor of national armies. You know, their ideology would be some kind of world government. That would be a consistent approach. So you would be anti-Zionism by extension, but not necessarily by direct focus. And again, if you claim to be a universalist anti-ethnic nation, but only talked about Israel, that might raise the question of, are you really opposed to all ethnic nations, or do you have a particular animus for this particular people? The expression of Doigkeit is most beautifully done in a song that emerged during the Second World War. It was written by Jews living in Eastern Europe who were fighting the Nazis, in some cases directly militarily. They were not pacifists. They were not hoping for outside delivery. They knew they were fighting sometimes for their own dignity in the face of certain death. This song was written by Hirsch Glick in response to hearing about the Warsaw Ghetto Rebellion in April and May of 1943. It was actually written in the Vilna Ghetto and inspired them there. But what it says is that even if we're fighting and this is not a happy ending song, we are still making an important statement. Zognit kein molas du geistem letzte Weg. Never say you're on the final road. Even though overhead dark skies of lead may death forebode. The long-awaited hour is surely drawing near. As vet the poik tun unser trot mir seinen da. With roar our steps will thunder and say, we are here. Da, here. We are here. And it goes on to say that wherever our blood has fallen to the ground, there our strength will sprout again. That's, again, that Doigkeit, getting your roots where you are. The song is written in blood and not with lead. It's not a song sung by free birds flying overhead. A people stood amid collapsing walls and sang this song with pistols in their hand. Mit Naganas in the hand. Then you go back to the first chorus and you end with a roar, our steps will thunder, mir seinen da, we are here. That's the Doigkeit of presence, history, and activism for a future. So that's a quick tour through Zionism, anti-Zionist Judaism, and diasporism as a positive ideology that does not need Israel at its center. You know, diasporists are not looking to destroy in Israel, but they don't want to define themselves by their positive or negative relationship to Israel. They want to define themselves by where Jews are all over the world. And, you know, we in secular humanistic Judaism draw on that Bundist Doigkeit ideology because we're not moving to Israel. Whether we support it or object to it, we're not moving there. We're going to continue living in this. There's even a wonderful book called New Jews, The End of Diaspora, ? By Karen Aviv and David Schneer, that asks the question, are we really in a diaspora anymore? Because after all, what's the homeland? Is it Israel? Is it Eastern Europe? Is it New York? Is it where you were raised? So for me, Detroit compared to Chicago? Well, what's your homeland and where are your roots? You know, all of these are flexible categories these days. And so maybe the idea of a center that we're all looking at from the diaspora, all pointing our synagogues to the same direction, maybe that's not the model for Jewish identity in the 21st century.
Maybe we're in a Hirspera.
Maybe we come up with another term. You know, I should have mentioned this at the beginning, but I'll mention it near the end. In Hebrew, the word for the Jews living outside of Israel historically was galut, which meant exile. But the word diaspora comes from Greek. And, you know, an exile means you're not where you long to return. But a diaspora means a spreading, dia, of spore, of seeds. And when you spread seeds around, they plant and they put down roots and they grow a little bit differently with different soil and different water and different air, but they're native to where they are. So a diaspora is in some ways a much more positive and a much more organic model for identity spread around the world than a galut, an exile, where you belong somewhere else. And so even the language of where you are and what you're doing can have an ideology behind it too.